many of our congregations rarely get to have, and we're blessed with all the talent here in this area. That's something I tell you I certainly appreciate and continue to do so. The talent and the willingness, not just talent. You know, people can have talent, but there has been over the years, in my experience here in this area, a willingness to share that talent and to serve and to do things that I've seen all across the congregation. That has been such a pleasure, and one of the reasons that willing heart and willing attitude, I think, is one of the things that made the 10 years I spent in South Louisiana such a very pleasant part of my life, because of just the willing heart and attitude. You know, that's one of the main things God looks at. We're told there's a good lesson there for us, because humanly, you know, we all tend to look at just what we can see. You know the example there when Samuel went to anoint a king. Now, God told Samuel where to go. He said, I want you to go to Bethlehem. I want you to go to the house of Jesse. Now, you know, God had gotten pretty specific. He told him what town to go to and whose house to go to. It would have been very simple to have said, and I want you to anoint Jesse's youngest son, David. But God didn't tell him that. He said, I have chosen a new king, and he is one of the sons of Jesse. I want you to go to Bethlehem, and I want you to go to the house of Jesse, and you will anoint one of his sons as king. So Samuel went. And, of course, first son that was introduced to him was the oldest son. When Samuel saw him, he just knew that was the man. You could look at him, tell he looked like a king. Big, strong, handsome-looking guy, you know, just the way he carried himself, presented himself. As soon as Samuel saw him, he just knew that was the king. He was ready to get his oil out. God said, no, not him. Oh, boy, the second one must really be impressive. Well, you know, they ran through, and Jesse brought in his sons one at a time, 7 of them. And each time, God told Samuel, this isn't the one. Finally, you know, they got to number 7, and this isn't the one. And, you know, Samuel must have been sort of perplexed, and he looked at Jesse, and he said, is this all? You don't have any other sons? Well, yeah, we got one. But he's out in the field taking care of the sheep. We didn't bother to bring him in. Well, we're not going to sit down and eat until he gets here. So you better send somebody to get him. And David came in, and God told Samuel, he said, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. You see, God saw something that Samuel didn't see. And I think the lesson, or part of why it's written out the way it is, was to impress that lesson. You know, it could have started with David, and you never would have even focused on the other sons. But I think God wanted Samuel to understand that Samuel was a lot more impressed with some people than God was. And we look, you know, back over the years, and we realize every one of us have been more impressed with some people than God was. I mean, as the story has gone by and unfolded, we realized that maybe what we were impressed with were the wrong things. Well, there's an important lesson there, and I think it's an important lesson for life. Now, I'm going to come back around to that. We've all heard that expression that God was looking for a man after his own heart, and David had the heart of a king. Well, I'm going to come back to that later on in the sermon and look a little bit at what it was about David. Why did God say of David that David, in that sense, had the heart of a king? What was God looking for? What did God see in David the shepherd that impressed God? And obviously God was more impressed than any people were at that time. David was a teenage boy, an older teenager, maybe 17 or so, sort of the That would sort of be my guess as you put the story together and look at what happened next in the sequence of events. But God obviously saw something that He was impressed with. And we'll look for that a little bit later. We live at a remarkable time in terms of Bible prophecy. We have seen a lot of things unfolding and are seeing things unfolding around us. Events in the Middle East of recent date with the death of King Hussein of Jordan and a transition that took place. Mr. Meredith referred to it in a recent letter. There have been a couple of articles in news magazines about the fact that the Middle East appears to be on the brink of a shift in terms of leaders. That it appears that virtually every leader in the Middle East may be replaced in the relatively near future. It could conceivably happen even within a year. May go on a little longer. But in point of fact, virtually every leader in the Middle East has serious health problems. Yasser Arafat is suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease. Several of them are suffering from severe, let's say, heart problems, cancer, various difficulties that are being suffered from virtually all of the major leaders. President Mubarak there in Egypt, President Assad up in Syria, the King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, several of the ones. In fact, as far as is known, about the only one over there who appears to be in good, robust health is Saddam Hussein. As far as anybody knows, nothing wrong with him. We can't even hit him with a bomb, you know. You look at that and you realize that we may very well, and of course nobody knows exactly the timing on that, but it appears that we are we're near a time when there will be a transition of leaders and an entirely different group of men will come to power, maybe even within a year, 18 months of one another. We, of course, also have other areas in the world. You can look at Russia, where the President Yeltsin has got serious health problems. Of course, his term ends in the year 2000. The Russian Parliament was evidently so impressed with our Congress that they have started impeachment proceedings against Yeltsin. You know, they're trying to copy the American way. There's turmoil, there's instability over there. Their economy has virtually collapsed. And there is a weak, ailing leader, a power vacuum. You can look at things that are going on in Europe. Now, we look at all of these things, and we're excited, and we're intrigued by these things. And the reason we're intrigued is because we see that these events fit into Bible prophecy. And what excites us is not the hard times or the traumatic times or the terrible things that may happen in the years on ahead of us. But what excites us as we look at these things is that we think, we're getting close to the events that will set the stage for the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. And so what excites us is not the traumatic things, is not the terrible difficulties that the world is going to have to go through. But the fact that we know that right beyond that time of pain and trouble lies the solution to all of the pains and sorrows and griefs, to all of the yearnings of humanity from the time that Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden. You know, it's sort of interesting. You go back in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve were expelled. You know, there are three things that are mentioned there that were introduced. Pain and sorrow and fear are mentioned right there in Genesis 3. It's interesting as you talks about the things that Eve was going to suffer and the things that Adam was going to suffer, and you find they were afraid. You know, that's why they hid, and the emphasis on the fact of the sorrow and the pain, and ultimately, of course, the death that would come. When you get to the end of the book of Revelation, you find those are the things that are banished. Those are the things that are removed. And so we've lived in a world of fear. We've lived in a world of pain. We've lived in a world of sorrow, of hard bondage and difficulty and adversity. We've lived in a world marked by death. But we know there's one who overcame that, who triumphed, and who's going to return in a few years. He's going to return in power and glory. And when he does, not only is he going to return, but you see, we have the hope of being changed. Transformed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, changed and transformed and caught up to meet Jesus Christ. And then we're going to be with him, and what are we going to do? We're going to rule and reign. I'd like to pose the question, what are you and I doing? How are we preparing for ruling and reigning with Jesus Christ? What does that mean? Sometimes we read these concepts and we've read, we'll be kings and priests, and we understand that that's what the words say. But most of us sometimes have difficulty relating to those expressions. What does that mean? How does that translate for you and for me? What will it mean to rule with Jesus Christ? The Bible talks quite a bit about rulership, and some of the things that it says may be things with which we're very familiar, and other things that it says may be things that we haven't necessarily thought about or connected. I would like for us to look a little bit at what the Bible says about rulership, and both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. There are several different words, 3 primary words in the Old Testament and 3 primary words in the New Testament that are all translated rule or rulership. First place this term is used in the book of Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 verse 16. This is talking about the sun and the moon. God made 2 great lights. Sun and the moon. The greater to rule the day and the lesser to rule the night. Made the stars also. That's the first place we read about rulership, and talks about the sun and the moon. Now, here in this context, when talking about the great light, the sun ruling the day, that simply means that the sun dominates the day. It is there. It is the most visible, the most dominant body. It is the one that is there, just as the moon is dominant at night. And on down, that same term is referred to again in verse 18. Now, as we come on down, this is the same term that God uses in Genesis 3:16, where after the sin of Adam and Eve, God told Eve in Genesis 3:16, "Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In sorrow you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be to your husband, and he shall rule over you." Same term referring back to Genesis 1, reference to the same term that's used in reference to the sun and the moon. Now let's come on down even a little further in the book of Genesis, and we'll notice a couple of other things. Genesis chapter 15, God told Abram, Genesis 15:1, "After these things the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I'm your shield, your exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus." The word translated steward here is the same word, ruler. Eliezer was the ruler of his house. Now, to be a ruler doesn't mean that you have unlimited power. It doesn't mean you can just do anything you want to. Eliezer couldn't just do anything he chose to do. It was Abraham's household. But Eliezer was the manager. He was the ruler. He was the one who oversaw Abraham's property and his servants and all of the things that Abraham had. Abraham obviously trusted him. We're told in another verse that it's required of a steward that he must be found faithful. One of the primary characteristics or requirements of a steward. And this is a term that simply means a ruler, one who rules on behalf of another, is that he is faithful, someone who can be counted on, someone who can be depended upon. Abraham had confidence in this man and therefore gave him great responsibility of overseeing and managing his property on a day-to-day basis. He obviously had confidence in the man's ability and in his integrity. And that is a tremendous combination. Same term is used back in Genesis 24. Verse 1, we read that Abraham was old, well stricken in years. The Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house that ruled over all that he had. That ruled. That was the steward, that was the manager, the supervisor of what Abraham had, of Abraham's property. This term, rule or ruler, has to do with oversight, with rule, with government, with let's look on. Let's go even a little further. Let's go back to 2 Samuel. Now, King David, we've already talked a little bit about him. He was a man after God's own heart. 2 Samuel chapter 23. David is at the end of his life. In 2 Samuel 23:1, we're told the last words of David. Here is what David had to tell his son Solomon. David had been king for 40 years. He was now at the end of his life. These be the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, said, and the man who was raised up on high and anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. Here's what he said. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and His word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me, He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be as the light of the morning when the sun arises. Even a morning without clouds is the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. You know how it is. We're getting to that time of year. And we have the spring rains. You plant your garden. And after a rain, you get up one morning and it's a beautiful day. Clouds are gone. The sun comes out and it's just nice, a beautiful, warm spring day, bright sunshine. And what do you find? Within just a very short time, 2 or 3 days after that, you see this little bit of green beginning to come up. You see, you can have all the rain, you can have all the things, and the sun, when the bright sunshine comes out after the rain, it's like the new green growth. Things begin to grow. And the garden begins to come up, and the grass begins to green. David drew an analogy here. We saw that the term rule was used for the sun. David drew an analogy here. He said, son, you're going to be king. He that rules. He that rules. Same word we've been looking at. We're preparing to be rulers. He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Two things that are emphasized. Now, if you truly rule in the fear of God, you will be just. Because to rule in the fear of God means that you are deeply conscious and aware of the presence of the living, real God. That God is real to you. And you live your life with a deep consciousness of walking before God. You know, it's amazing. People sort of sometimes look around. They want to see who's looking, who's watching, who's listening. Well, they're looking in the wrong direction. You know, if we want to know who's looking, if we want to know who's listening, we need to look up. You know, God's hearing's pretty good. His eyesight's very good. You can be in a dark room where the light's turned out. God still sees. just as well. If we rule in the fear of God, when you look at the things that go on, as you look at our society, at our nation, you look at political leaders, you look at business leaders, you look at all the things that go on behind closed doors. You know, the term was used always for many years talking about political decisions, that it was made in a smoke-filled room. You know, cronies got together in there, closed all the doors, nobody else could listen in. They sat in there, they worked out a deal, and then they came out and told whatever story they had all agreed on. Of course, we've never had anything happen like that in Louisiana. You know, our former governor, Edwards, he made the statement. You know how he proved this? You know how he proved what an honest man he was? You heard that, didn't he? He called a press conference. This is true. He called a press conference, and he said, "I can prove to you what an honest man I am." He said, "I've been indicted 24 times and never convicted a single time." That ought to prove to you what an honest man I am. Well, you know, all of the things that go on behind closed doors, whether it's business leaders or political leaders or various ones who control power, those who rule in the fear of God realize that they're not truly behind closed doors, that the windows of heaven are open. And their discussions and their decisions are made in the presence of the Creator and Governor of the universe. So King David told his son, he said, he that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God, to be fair and equitable in his decisions, because he is conscious of walking before God. And a man who does that, then David compared, he said, your rule will be like sunshine. Just like the bright sunshine brings forth new growth, and the land flourishes and the crops come up, and it is peaceful and pleasant, and things grow. If you're ruling in the fear of God, and if your rule is just and in the fear of God, then your reign will be like sunshine. It will create an environment where the whole nation will grow, it will bloom and blossom and bear fruit. It'll be wonderful. You see, that's the kind of rulership that God wants to see. And that's what rulership in the world to come will be like. David described here. His last words centered on what he had learned as a king and what was required to be the right kind of ruler. Now, God obviously concluded that David had come to understand some things about rulership, because you see there are many scriptures we could go to in Ezekiel 37 and other places, Ezekiel 34, where we find that David is going to be raised up to be king over all of Israel, over all the tribes in the world to come, the world tomorrow. So obviously, the principles of rulership David had learned were right principles. Let's go on a little further. We can go back to the Psalms, and might just notice here briefly in Psalm 8. Psalm 8, verse 1, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. Goes on to say in verse 3, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you visit him? Now, you know, that's quite something. We've all been out in the country, and it's much more impressive in the country than it is even in a town the size of Lafayette. But when you're out in a rural area, there's not a lot of light around, and you look up at the sky, and you see all of the stars. You know, for most of us, if we even a small town, it's amazing how much diffused light there is around. And you get used to what you see. But then on those times when you're out away from it all, and you look up, it's just sort of overwhelming how many stars there are. It's like you almost forget. And you look up and you see that. And it has to impress you as to how tiny we are. There's just something overwhelming as you look up and you see all of the magnitude and the greatness of what God has done. David spent a lot of time during his lifetime out in the open, away from things. He spent a number of years of his adolescence as a shepherd. A lot of time out in the dark field where the sheep were bedded down, and he was looking up and must have seen the sky just lit with diamonds. And he said, when I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the things that you made, when I look up and consider that, then the question I have is, what in the world is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man that you visit him. You've made him a little lower, or temporarily lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honor. You've made him to have dominion, to have rulership. Over the works of your hands, you've put all things under his feet. Now, you know, that's quoted back in Genesis 1, Genesis 1, where God said, that's in Genesis 1:26 and 1:28, where we're told that man was made to have, God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let him have dominion. So David hearkens back to that verse in the Psalms, and he says, when I consider all that you have made and how great you are, and I consider little tiny man, and yet you've made him to have dominion, to have rulership over all of the things that you've made. Now, you know, David quotes, or Paul quotes that back in Hebrews. He quotes from Psalm 8. And he says, as he quotes it, well, let's just turn there. Let's see, in Hebrews 2. He quotes it, Hebrews 2:6. One in a certain place testified, what is man, that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that you visit him? You've made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with honor and glory. Did set him over the works of your hands. You've put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not yet all things put under him. You see, this part Paul adds. The Psalm says, you've put all things in subjection under his feet. That's the end of his quote. Paul then says, you know, when he said all, he meant all. In that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that's not under him. Because all includes everything, doesn't it? Now that was the implication. That's not focused on in the Old Testament, but Paul said, you know, God's plan for mankind goes far beyond just simply the fact that he is dominant over the cattle and the sheep and the fish and the birds. Oh yes, man has dominance over that. He's, by mind and ability, he's able to dominate for good or for bad. But God's ultimate destiny is to put all things, in that he said all, he left nothing that's not put under him. Now you look up at the stars, and you see as far as the eye can see. And our naked eye can't even begin to discern the number of stars. You look through a telescope and you see stars that you didn't even know were there. You look through a bigger telescope and you see even more. And it's incredible. And you look at that and you realize that God said that he's put all things under our feet, but we see not yet all things. But our destiny is to rule all things under God. Everything in all directions forever. You and I can't even grasp that. A little man talks about conquering outer space, and that means we send something up, really a few miles up, sort of in orbit around the Earth's atmosphere. We've really conquered outer space. We finally got all the way to the moon. You look at outer space, it stretches out for trillions of light years, and we got a few miles from home. We stand there on the moon, we've conquered the universe. We've conquered outer space. We got a flag right here on the moon. But it's nothing by comparison. It's an incredible promise, a promise of rulership. But let's go on. Let's understand a little more of that, of what's involved as far as that rulership, that destiny. In Psalm 103, verse 19, the Lord has prepared His throne in the heavens. His kingdom rules over all. Verse 22, bless the Lord, all His works, in all places of His dominion. Bless the Lord, O my soul. His kingdom rules over all, His dominion. And God is giving us and intends to give us the opportunity to share that kingdom, to share that dominion. And that is an awesome calling. Let's go on back to the book of Proverbs, and let's notice a couple of things that are necessary. First, we'll notice in Proverbs 12:24. Proverbs 12:24. The hand of the diligent shall bear rule, but the slothful shall be under tribute. So if we want to exercise God's rule, if we want to rule under Jesus Christ, we're told here that one of the keys, one of the things that prepares an individual to rule is diligence. Now, diligence goes beyond just simply working hard. It carries with it a connotation of consistency. It's not just somebody that goes out sort of in fits and starts. The old childhood fable about the hare and the tortoise, who had the race, and one had great speed, but he was certainly not diligent. He was not consistent. There are people who have great ability. We've all known people that we knew were very intelligent, very capable, had tremendous ability, but they never really amounted to anything because they never stuck to a job. They weren't consistent. They weren't diligent. They did not put their effort to something and day in, day out, consistently stick with it. They went out and went great guns for a couple of days, and then they got tired of it, got bored, got mad, or whatever it was, and they quit, or they, didn't show up. And then, a little while later, they got something else, and boy, they went carrying off great guns there. But it didn't last very long either. They got tired of it, got bored with it, got distracted. They lacked diligence, and so they never got ahead. There are others, whether it's students in school or people in the workplace, that may not have quite as much ability. They may not be as quick, may not be quite as smart, may not be quite as whatever it is. But they put forth diligent effort. You can count on them. They are there day after day doing their best. And the cumulative results of their efforts is they get ahead. The hand of the diligent shall bear rule. You see, one of the things God is after, one of the character traits in our life is diligence. Now, you and I all know sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder. There are times that things may seemingly go along okay. And there are times that it seems like there's one obstacle and one mountain after another to climb. Maybe you don't feel like you're making much progress. And maybe you're not going very fast. But if you're diligent, you just keep on keeping on. That's another way of saying he that endures to the end. It's not a matter of how fast you're going? Are you keeping on keeping on? Are you being diligent? The hand of the diligent shall bear rule. The slothful, the one who's lazy and the one who's the quitter, shall be under tribute. That's not a characteristic of rulership. Diligence is. Well, let's go on back a little further in Proverbs 16. Proverbs 16, verse 32, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He that rules his spirit than he that takes a city. Here's the same word, rule. Now, you know, people, world history's been made by people who wanted to be rulers. There's no shortage of people that want to rule over somebody else. We've had conquerors and would-be conquerors. People who've gone out and some of them have been very capable individuals. Alexander the Great conquered the world of his day. An empire that stretched from Europe all the way to India. But Alexander never learned to rule himself. He choked on his own vomit in a drunken debauch there in Babylon. By the time he was 30 years old, his life was gone. He had done everything, gone everywhere, conquered all this, but he never conquered himself. He never conquered it. He couldn't control and rule his own appetites, his own passions. But how many so-called rulers have never even learned to rule themselves? They can't rule and control themselves. They can't rule their passions, their appetites. He that's slow to anger is better than the mighty. He that rules his spirit than he that takes a city. It takes more effort. It is a greater conquest to conquer yourself. People are ruled by all sorts of things. Ruled by their fears. Ruled by their passions, their emotions. Ruled by what they think other people expect. Ruled and dominated and controlled by all sorts of things. But you see, God wants us to voluntarily surrender ourselves to Him and to His rule. And He will then make rulers out of us. The term overcome, we use it quite often. The New Testament talks about overcoming. He that overcomes. And the message to each one of the 7 churches, Revelation 2 and 3, to him that overcomes, to him that overcomes. The word overcome in the Greek language is Nike. We use it today. We pronounce it Nike. We've got a whole line of athletic wear. You know, it just means conquer in Greek. Boy, you wear these shoes, you're going to conquer. You're going to conquer the court. America had a big missile, and they called it the Nike Hercules. That was one of the ancient titles of the Greek god Hercules. Hercules the Conqueror. So we built a missile, and we thought that was going to help us rule the world. We named it Hercules the Conqueror. Nike Hercules. Nike. That's the word Christ used all the way through the New Testament. Talks about it. Any time you see the word overcome, that's what it's translated. It doesn't mean you're just supposed to. He that wears his Nikes will. Meaning goes a little beyond that. See, it's talking here. He that rules his spirit, he that conquers, that overcomes, he that conquers himself. That's what it means to overcome, to conquer yourself. The passions and the appetites that rule our lives. Because those passions and appetites will make slaves of us rather than rulers of us. Well, let's go on. Let's look a little further. There is another term that's used for rule in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament. Let's look at a couple of places where that is used. Back in the book of Leviticus, tells us something else about rulership. Has a very similar meaning to the first word, not any great difference or distinction between them that comes out. But let's notice in Leviticus 25, this is a part of the law that deals with the Jubilee and that deals with the economy of Israel. And in Leviticus 25, it talks about servants. And in verse 43 of Leviticus 25, it says, "You shall not rule over him," speaking of your servant, "you shall not rule over him with rigor, but shall fear your God." You don't rule over him with rigor, with harshness. So rulership, God says, is not to be exercised with rigor, where you rule with hardness and you just grind somebody down because he's under you. He's under and I'm over, and I'm just going to grind him in the ground. God says, you better fear me. You better be in reverence and awe of me and realize that while you may be over someone else, I'm over you. And you want to just grind him in the ground? Well, you know, how would you like it if I just ground you in the ground? I don't know, you wouldn't like that. So a principle of rulership, you know, you look at how rulership has been exercised. And we're going to look at that a little bit in the New Testament. But the principles come from the Old Testament as well. You see, when you look at the Caesars and the Herods of the world, in their view, the people existed for the benefit of the ruler. And life was cheap. And they exercised their power to just grind in the ground anybody that they wanted to. Well, God's law said when you are over someone, when you have a servant, you have someone under you, don't rule over him with rigor. Don't rule over him with hardness and harshness, but you fear me. Be conscious of the fact that you're living your life before me, the ruler of the universe. Leviticus 26, verse 17. Here is a chapter that talks about blessings and cursings. And God talks about, in verse 14, if you will not hearken to me and do these commandments, if you will despise my statutes and abhor my judgments. God talked about various problems that would come. And he said, in verse 17, I will set my face against you, and you shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign over you, shall rule over you. You see, our nation is filled with people that don't want God to rule over them. It's as though, well, you know, God's law is harsh. Boy, we don't want to be under that old law. We don't want God telling us what to do. God says, you know, my way is really the easy way. My yoke is light. My burden is easy. If you won't voluntarily submit to me, if you won't value and love my rulership, the rule of my law, and my ways in your life, then ultimately those that hate you will rule over you. And then you'll find out. Because you see, God loves us. God's rule is exercised in love. When God says no, that no is said in love. When God says, do this, that command is issued in love. You know, parents, most of us here are parents. We either have or have had little children. And we've certainly all been little children. When parents tell their little child, no, don't go out there. Don't, follow your ball. Don't go out in the street. Don't stick that in the light socket. Don't, reach up and grab a hold of the hot frying pan. Why do you say no? Is it because you don't want them to have any fun? Now, sometimes little kids think that. Think, everything that looks like fun, they won't let me do. But you see, we know it's because you know there are consequences they can't even imagine. They haven't had enough life's experience to understand what happens in certain circumstances. God's rule over us is exercised in love. Those who are unwilling to appreciate the rule of one who loves us will ultimately find out what it's like to be under the rule of those that hate them. And they will come to value and appreciate the rule of God. We could look at other places. Let's go back to Ezekiel 34. Ezekiel 34. Now, prophesy and say unto them, Thus says the Lord God unto the shepherds, Woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flock? You eat the fat, you clothe you with wool, you kill them that are fed, but you feed not the flock. The diseased have you not strengthened, neither have you healed that which was sick, neither have you bound up that which was broken, neither have you brought again that which was driven away, neither have you sought that which was lost, but with force and with cruelty have you ruled them. Now, in the context, if you want to just follow Ezekiel 34 in the context, it is talking about leaders of national Israel, because as you come on down in Ezekiel 34, God says in verse 22, I will save my flock. They will be no more a prey. I'll judge between cattle and cattle. And I will set one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them. Even my servant David, he shall feed them, and shall be their shepherd. And the Lord will be their God, and my servant David a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken it. So, David is going to be king over all of Israel. And it talks about, on down in verse 30, they shall know that I, the Lord God, am with them, and that they, even the house of Israel, are my flock, are my people, says the Lord. You, my flock, the flock of my pasture, are men, and I'm your God. So in the context, it certainly is a reference to national Israel and to the leaders. But the principle applies in every context. The principle applies to the church. The principle applies to, you see, the term shepherd is used as an analogy of one who is a leader, one who has rule over. And we're going to see that even more clearly when we get to the New Testament. But we find here that this matter of rulership, God calls the leaders shepherds. So anyone who is in a position of leadership, whether it has to do with national leaders, or whether it has to do with leaders in the church, whether it has to do with one who is the leader of his own family. You know, he is the shepherd of his family, of his wife and children. You see, a ruler is defined here, described as a shepherd. Now that, therein lies the key. David had the heart of a king. God said he's a man after my own heart. David had the heart of a king because first and foremost, David had the heart of a shepherd. And the heart of a true shepherd is the heart of a king. You know, some things about David's character were made manifest. We don't know a whole lot about David's days as a shepherd. We just read bits and pieces. One specific incident or that we read of, well, more than one incident, but one specific character trait that is illustrated. You remember when David came before Saul? He was a young man, wasn't yet 20 because he hadn't been drafted to the army. He'd come up there to bring food for his older brothers who were in the army. So David was maybe, 18 or whatever. 20 was the age in Israel. David had come up there, and Saul brought it, and Goliath was challenging the Israelites, and David said, I'll go. And Saul brought him in. He says, you don't know what you're doing. This guy's a giant. He's been a warrior from his youth. You're you're not even dry behind the ears. And David said, well, I've been a shepherd. He said, one time a bear came and grabbed a lamb out of the flock. And you know what I did? I went after that bear and I got that lamb back. One time a lion came and got a lamb out of the flock. And I went after that lion and I killed him. And I rescued that lamb. Now, God looked at David and he said, here's a man that takes his responsibility so seriously, because when David went after the lion and the bear, he didn't stand way off with his .30-06 and bring them down from a distance. God looked at that and he said, here is a man, here's a boy, that takes his responsibility so seriously that he's willing to go to any length to avoid losing even one that's under his charge. If he has got the kind of heart that will go to that length for a little lamb, then I can put him over my people and know to what length he will go to help and to save one of my people. Because if he's got that kind of heart to look after an animal, then that's the kind of heart, that's the kind of attitude that I want when I put someone as the shepherd over my people, as the ruler over my people. David had the heart of a shepherd. And because he had the heart of a shepherd, he had what was in reality the heart of a king. So when God got ready to train Moses, to prepare Moses to rule, Moses was the first ruler of Israel. And God made Moses the ruler over Israel, used him to rule Israel 40 years. He was used as the lawgiver, as the one who organized the nation, led them and ruled them for 40 years. Now there's a new movie out, Moses, Prince of Egypt. Well, Moses had to get over being a prince of Egypt before he could be a prince of Israel. He spent 40 years as Moses, shepherd of Jethro's sheep, to prepare him to be the shepherd of God's sheep. Mr. Armstrong used to say it's a lot harder to unlearn than it is to learn. Well, Moses, you can rest assured, spent 40 years dealing with the sheep, unlearning a lot of what he had learned as a prince of Egypt. Because the princes of Egypt weren't very good shepherds. In fact, the princes of Egypt exercised harshness over the people. I mean, all you have to do is just read a little bit of Egyptian history, and you realize life was cheap in ancient Egypt. Life was cheap. You look at all the building projects of the pharaohs. They lined up thousands of people. When they got ready to build those pyramids, they didn't use hydraulic cranes. They used ramps and pulleys and thousands of people. And they worked people to death. You read about it, Moses had a lot of unlearning to do. And he spent 40 years as a shepherd, learning to be a good shepherd. And when after 40 years he had learned to be a good shepherd, God said, now, I'm going to send you back to Egypt and let you bring my people out. You've learned to shepherd sheep, now I'm going to let you shepherd my people, because the same principles apply. So Moses was trained as a shepherd. David was trained as a shepherd. Now, we go through the word, by the way, any time in the New Testament you read the word pastor, it's translated from exactly the same Greek word that is translated shepherd. So, you read about, Christ said, I am the good shepherd, back in John 10. Well, that same word is used pastor. Now, you can go through and read it, and certainly the principles of it apply to the ministry. But if you're going to be a ruler, it applies to you too. It applies to every one of us in terms of the principles of rulership. You see, the idea is he starts out talking about the leaders here and his indictment against the shepherds of Israel, against the leaders in Ezekiel 34, is they had the idea that the people existed for the benefit of the leader. And Christ pointed out that it's the reverse. The leader exists for the benefit of the people. It's a totally different way of looking at it. We're going to see that in just a few moments as we go back to what Christ said. Well, you see, the problem was here was a selfish, self-centered approach. Now, if we're going to be rulers under Jesus Christ in the world to come, then we can't take with us into that authority. We're going to have rulership, dominion over all things. But if we take with us attitudes of selfishness and self-centeredness, then that means we would misuse that authority simply for our own convenience. Jesus Christ came. He said, all power in heaven and earth is given unto me. How did Jesus Christ use that power? He used it for the good of those of everyone else. Ultimately, for the good of all mankind. You see, the principle that's brought out here, David is going to be the shepherd. God says, I'm going to raise up David as a prince. Because the shepherds of Israel have not been good shepherds. They have abused their authority. And this indictment, while in specific context applies certainly to national leaders, it applies to leaders in any circumstance. And certainly it is descriptive. The principles apply in the church, they apply in the family, they apply in the nation, they apply in every context. And it's an important area to go through and to understand clearly. Now let's go on. Let's look at some things in the New Testament. The New Testament has a lot about leadership and rulership. In Matthew chapter 2, Matthew 2 and verse 6, when Jesus Christ was to be born, let's notice what Christ was born in Bethlehem. Matthew 2 verse 1. Herod, the wise men had come to Herod and asked him, where is he that's born king of the Jews? Boy, you talking about getting Herod stirred up. He thought he was the king of the Jews. And when somebody came and said, we're looking for the one who was born to be the king of the Jews, Herod began to get nervous. And so he called everybody together and threatened them direly and said, I want you to tell me where the Messiah is to be born. And so, verse 6, they told him, verse 5, they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, you Bethlehem, this is quoting from Micah chapter 5, you Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of you shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Out of you shall come a governor. Christ was born to govern. He was born to rule. This word that's translated governor here is the same word that's used in Luke 22. Christ was born to be governor of the people of Israel. He was born as the Messiah, to be king. Luke 22:26. Well, we pick up the story in verse 24, Luke 22:24. There was strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest? He said unto them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors. It shall not be so. You shall not be so. He that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. He that is chief, as he that does serve. The word that's translated chief here in verse 26 is the same word translated governor back in Matthew 2 and verse 6. So Christ said that there would be government, there would be a governor, a chief, a ruler. He that's greatest among you, let him be as the younger. He that is chief, he that is governor, he that's the ruler, as he that does serve. Because he went on to say, verse 29, I appoint unto you a kingdom, as my Father has appointed unto me, that you shall eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus Christ was going to set up a real kingdom, a real government, and they were preparing to rule in that kingdom, to sit on thrones, exercising governorship, rulership over the tribes of Israel. But how? Well, Christ said, I've set you an example. You see, the rulers of this world think that the people are there for their benefit. And so they take advantage of their position. And they use it to selfish advantage. And they extract from the people because they're in a position of authority. And so they use that position of authority in a selfish way. Now Christ said, "It shall not be so among you. He that is chief, he that is governor, he that is in charge, should be the one that serves the most." You see, leadership, rulership, from God's perspective, is not about that the people are for the benefit of the ruler, but that the ruler is for the benefit of the people. That ought to translate at home in the family. He that's chief, he that's the governor. Well, the husband, the father, he is the chief, the governor, the ruler of the family. That term is used. We saw it all the way back in Genesis 1 and Genesis 3. Well, what is he supposed to do? He's supposed to be the one that serves. Serving his wife, serving his children, helping, building, encouraging, benefiting. Jesus Christ was the chief. He was the ruler. He set an example of service, of helping, of building, of encouraging, of benefiting. That's an important concept. It flies in the face of the self-centered attitudes that permeate our society, where people think that a position of authority is an opportunity to sort of aggrandize the self, to take advantage of circumstances, to benefit themselves in a selfish way. How many nations, little tiny poverty-stricken third world nations, the ruler's been amassing huge fortunes, got millions of dollars, in some cases upwards of $1 billion stashed away in some Swiss bank account or some offshore bank account. And eventually when, people finally overthrow him, he flees to some place and continues to live like a prince because he's ripped off the people. They were there for his benefit. You take a place like Haiti, little tiny poverty-stricken Haiti. And when Duvalier, the dictator, Baby Doc, as he was called, his father was Papa Doc, and he was Baby Doc. And when he fled, well, he didn't go into a jail cell. He went down to the French Riviera. And he had millions of dollars. American aid that went to Haiti to feed poor, hungry people down there, that was like water down a rat hole. Only he was the rat, and it was his hole that it went into. Now, that is not a unique situation. That has existed over and over, not just in our century, but in centuries past. Christ was impressing on the disciples. He said, that's not the pattern of government we're going to have. The time is coming when you're going to sit on thrones ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel. And Herod sits over on a throne ruling over one of the tribes right now. He's ruling over Judah. And I don't intend that you are going to be a Herod when you sit on the throne. You're not going to rule like Herod did or does. You're not going to have his approach, his attitude. You're not going to look at things the way he does. I'm showing you the way a ruler, the way a governor is to be. You go back to the book of Acts, chapter 15. Well, let's notice in Acts. Let's go to Acts 15. Here in verse 22. This is after the conference in Acts 15. In verse 22, then it pleased the apostles and the elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, surnamed Barsabbas, and Silas, chief men among the brethren. This term chief here is the same word that Jesus used back in in Luke 22, and it's the same word that was used to describe Jesus Christ in Matthew 2:6, translated governor. So here were a couple of leading men, chief men in positions of rulership, governorship among the brethren. We know one thing about them. If they were chief men among the brethren, they were obviously men who were diligent servants of God's people, because Christ said, "He that's chief among you is he that does serve." So obviously these men had been men of outstanding service. They were responsible or chief governors among the brethren. They were leaders, and they were selected to go with Paul and Barnabas as representative of the group there. Now, let's go on. Let's look a little further. Let's go back to Acts 12, or Romans 12 rather. Here's another word, a different word. It means literally to be at the head of, to preside, to stand before in rank, to rule, or to care for. This is the word that's used in Romans 12. In Romans 12 and verse 4, it talks about we have many members in the body, and all the members have not the same office. And verse 6, we have gifts differing one from another. And we should use those gifts according to what is given. Prophecy. Let us prophesy. Well, prophecy had to do with inspired speaking. It was not limited to a foretelling of the future, but speaking under inspiration of God. Or ministering, let us wait on our ministering. It just means serving. He that teaches, some have an ability to teach and to explain, or some to exhort, to stir up, to motivate others. A little different than teaching. He that gives, let him do with simplicity. He that rules, he that presides, he that's, that has the ability to preside or to administer, we might say. Let him do it with diligence. Let him be careful and consistent in putting effort into the way that he administers, that he rules, that he presides. He that shows mercy with cheerfulness. So it goes through and says there are different gifts. There are those who have administrative ability, those who just have a knack for getting in and helping and serving, those who have a special ability to motivate others, others who may have a special gift to explain and to make something clear. There are a variety of gifts. And some may have more than one, and we've all got various combinations of talents. God gives us certain abilities, enhances those abilities through His Spirit, and we're to realize that whatever ability we have, it came from God. There's a place for all of these things. See, back in 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul told the Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians 5:12, we beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you. Now, this word over you is the same word. Those who preside over you, those who, stand before in rank, those who are the leaders who administer. Same word we've been looking at. So he talks about those who labor among you. He says, know them, esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake, and be at peace among yourselves. So Paul said, get to know them and appreciate their labor and their endeavor. God's not the author of confusion. It's amazing. It seems like the world wants to go to one extreme or the other. They either, look at rulership as somebody to be harsh and to just sort of grind down and use for selfish advantage. Or then they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, nobody ought to be in charge of anything. Well, everybody ought to be equally in charge. Well, that's chaos. That's known as confusion. God's not the author of confusion. That's plain here in the New Testament. 1 Timothy 3, verse 4, Paul is here talking about to Timothy, a young evangelist that he had left, and he was giving him instructions in terms of organizing the church. And he talked about if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desire a good work. The word bishop is episkopos, means literally an overseer. That's a term you'd use like for the foreman of a construction site. He's the overseer. He's the one who's there to supervise. Now here it's used in a spiritual sense. Man desire the office of an overseer. Well, what qualifications was an individual who was to be given oversight in the church, what kind of person was he to be? Well, Paul told Timothy, he said he needs to be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that rules well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity, for if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? If he can't, talking about if we're going to set someone to preside over the church, first, Paul told Timothy, he says, look and see how he presides in his household. Look and see how he exercises rulership in his home, because that tells you something about the character of the man. And he will administer rulership in the church, oversight in the church, pretty much the way he exercises oversight in his home. Coming on down about deacons, mentions the same thing. Verse 12, deacons be the husbands of one wife. Verse 12, ruling their children in their own houses well. Exercising oversight, presiding, as it were. That's what the word means. So, we find here that Paul is instructing Timothy in terms of organizing the church and selecting those who would exercise oversight in the congregation. And he gave him qualifications. He said, now we don't want a man who's greedy because he will exercise oversight. If he's greedy of filthy lucre, what will he do? Well, he'll exercise oversight to, extract money from people. We certainly don't want that. He'll take advantage of people and for selfish advantage. We don't want someone who's covetous, who will use a position of oversight to sort of acquire what others have. We want someone who is given to hospitality, who's apt to teach, someone who's a giver, someone who can do these things. Not someone given to wine, no striker. We don't want someone in an oversight capacity who's drunk and who gets mad and, attacks people and does things like that. Not a brawler. So you don't want somebody like that in oversight, because what will he do? You see, there are principles here. So Paul says, look and see how he presides over his household. And that is a good evidence that you can look at his approach in that way, and that's what you will carry on out to the church. Now, let's go back. Let me show you one more word that is used. And it's the word that's used in Matthew 2, verse 6. We saw there are two words used in Matthew 2, 6. It talks about that out of you shall come a governor. We already looked at that one. That shall rule my people Israel. A governor shall rule. Now, what does that mean? He shall rule my people Israel. Well, this is the term that's used back in John 21. Verse 16, when Jesus was speaking to Peter, he said unto him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, do you love me? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said unto him, feed my sheep. The word translated feed my sheep here is the word shepherd. Shepherd my sheep. To be a shepherd. No, the shepherd is to feed the sheep. He's to take care of the sheep. The word, when it says, out of you shall come the governor, he shall rule my people Israel, the word is shepherd. Out of you shall come the governor, and the governor shall shepherd my people. He told Peter, he said, Peter, I want you to be a shepherd. I want you to feed my sheep. It's what Paul told the Ephesian elders in Acts 22. Or Acts 20, excuse me. Acts 20, verse 28. Paul told them in verse 27, he said, I'm not shunned to declare unto you the whole counsel of God. Take heed therefore unto yourself and to all the flock over which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. So you are in a position of responsibility and authority, of rulership over the flock of God. What are you to do? Feed the church of God. Shepherd the church of God, which he's purchased with his own blood. You're to be a shepherd. He's to rule my people Israel. Matthew 2:6. Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. The word is used. The word is used right here. Feed the church. Shepherd the church. That's what the term means. Let's go finally back here to Revelation. And let me show you something. In Revelation chapter 2, we've read this many times, Revelation 2:26. He that overcomes and keeps my words unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. The word rule here is the word shepherd. He shall shepherd them with a rod of iron. Now, what does a shepherd do with a rod of iron? Is that to go around and beat the sheep? No, it's to protect the sheep from the predators. The shepherd with a rod of iron didn't use the rod on the sheep. He used it on the wolf and the lion and the bear. So Christ said, I'm going to have you shepherd with a rod of iron. I'm going to equip you to protect my people. And if anyone comes to hurt or to destroy, you'll smash them like a potter's vessel. You won't put up with that. To him that overcomes and keeps my works will I give power over the nations. We are preparing, qualifying to receive power. But you see, a starting point is we first have to exercise God's power over ourselves. We're preparing to use power, to be given power, so that we might shepherd the people of God. Jesus Christ in Revelation 12, the statement is made here in Revelation 12, up in where in verse 5, she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations, who was to shepherd all nations with a rod of iron. The child was caught up to God, to his throne, speaking of Christ. The man-child who was to rule, who was to shepherd all the nations. You see, we've seen rulership is the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. We started in Genesis 1, and we're way back here almost to the end of Revelation. The Bible is a book about government. It's a book about rulership. Man was created to have dominion over the works of God. And he put all things under. But we see not yet all things. We're preparing to rule and reign with Jesus Christ as kings and priests. But first we must learn to rule ourselves and to rule in whatever context that we have opportunity today. Our own lives and our families, on our jobs, in the context of the church, and whatever areas of responsibility we have, to utilize the principles that God lays out in His Word. We are training and preparing as rulers, as shepherds, that we might be given that opportunity to help and to serve and to build forever. Brethren, we have a great destiny that dwarfs any problem and any obstacle that you and I may face. And some of you are going through great personal trials and difficulties. Some of you have been through them, some of you are in the process, and others of us will face them. And none of us know exactly what specific things we may have to go through. But understand, the Scripture tells us that all of these things are like nothing. They're not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. We are being prepared for a destiny of rulership in the family of God. Let's draw near to God, yield to Him, learn to put into practice, to inculcate in our lives these principles of godly rulership, in every aspect that God gives us opportunity now, so that we might use these things in a right and a godly way on into eternity. Brethren, it's wonderful to be back here with you again, and look forward to visiting after services, and look forward to seeing you next time.